Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this day 3 of the Innovate for Water Marketplace. My name is Brian McIntosh. I'll be the MC for this morning, and we'd like to welcome you all here. We're in the top of the valley in Brisbane, not far from Maywar, the Brisbane River. And I'd like to, first of all, to open the day, invite Fred Hooper virtually to the stage to provide an acknowledgement of country. To give a little bit of background and introduction to Fred, Fred is a Murrawari man from the Murrawari Nation, which is situated between the Bockara and Warrego rivers, which straddle what is now known as Queensland and the New South Wales borders in the western part of New South Wales and the southwest of Queensland. Fred joined the Royal Australian Navy in 1979 at the age of 17 and served 6 years on both surface ships and submarines. He left the Navy in 1985 and has worked in the Commonwealth Public Service. After leaving the public service, he's worked in a number of First Nations organisations. He was responsible for the Murrawari Nation declaring their continued independence from the Crown of Great Britain. He is the chair of the Murrawari People's Council in the Northern Basin Aboriginal Nations, who represent 22 sovereign First Nations of the Northern Murray-Darling Basin. He's worked tirelessly over the past 10 years to secure water rights for First Nations and their peoples in the Northern Murray-Darling Basin. And it's a fantastic pleasure, both for the event and personally, to be able to invite Fred to provide an acknowledgement to country. Please come to the stage, Fred.
Great, thank you very much. So the last couple of days I've been giving a little story about a couple of things before I do the acknowledgement. This time I want to reinforce the National Cultural Flows Research Program that I talked about in my presentation yesterday. One of the sites for the National Cultural Flows Research was a place called Kuruman Swamp, which should be on your screen now. It's a little place, it's a swamp near a little place called Woolomaringal in northwest New South Wales on the Culgoa River. If you look at the slide that's up, if you look at the swamp, it's in the form of a snake's head or what we call the mundugala, which is the rainbow serpent. This particular swamp has a significance to the Murrawari people because it has a number of red river gums that grow off the river. So it's unusual for river red gums to grow off the river channel. And the river red gum for the Murrawari people is our most sacred plant, because the old people would sit underneath the river red gums and they would talk to our ancestors in the sky camp. So when our ancestors pass away, they go to the sky camp and they wait to come back and to be reborn on Earth. So the significance of the river red gum is an exceptional plant for us. Now, this swamp, pre-colonisation and pre-development upstream, if you go to the next slide, please, you would see in this slide and in the table that pre-development, the swamp would get inundated 86 times out of 100 years. You can see in the current column that it's only getting inundated 29 times out of that 100 years. And with the introduction of the Basin Plan, you would get it inundated at 48 times in 100 years. So there's some pretty disturbing numbers when it comes to First Nations culture and First Nations values and uses as well in relation to some of our sites along the Murray-Darling Basin. So hence the National Cultural Flows Research, and hence us getting water back into the system, whether whether we have to buy it for commercial uses and then use the leftover water to fill other things, or buy it for cultural purposes. So I've got my grandson with me, so he's joining in as well. Yeah, so that's a little bit of information about some of the research that took place as part of the Natural Cultural Flows research, and why it's important for First Nations to own and manage water. A recent report through Griffith University, Dr. C. Jackson and Dr. Lana Hartwig produced a report recently, and First Nations people own 0.1% of the water within the Murray-Darling Basin. So that's why it's important for us to advocate for water rights, water management, and water ownership. Thank you. So with that, I'll now acknowledge all of the sovereign First Nations of Australia, the First Nations around the world. I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past and present, and acknowledge their contribution to First Nations rights, not only in water, but a whole other range of rights, in particular within the United Nations and the work that First Nations do in the United Nations to affirm our rights, and in particular the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which sets out a number of what we call our rights under covenants and governance of the United Nations, and that as well. And I would also like to encourage the leaders of the future to lead with honour, dignity and respect for all. And this being the last day of the conference, or the workshop, or the forum, I'd like to thank everybody for participating in the forum over the last 3 days. It's been very interesting. There's been a lot of great presentations, and I'm sure there's some great presentations to come today, and rounding it off, I think, tonight. So with that, welcome everybody to this virtual world, and those in the room in Brisbane, welcome to the country that you're on. I can't welcome you to that country specifically, but welcome to the forum, and I hope everybody have a lovely day. Thank you very much, and talk to you soon.
Thank you very much, Fred, for that acknowledgement. We've got much to learn and much to do with regards to First Nations and cultural flows. So I'd like to now provide a little bit of a recap on the event so far before we hear from our keynote speaker this morning, Leanne Kemp, the Queensland Chief Entrepreneur. We're in day three. Day three is a little bit of a mix between solutions, finance, and some frameworks and approaches for encouraging innovation. And it builds on day two, yesterday, where we spent most of the day listening to pitches focusing on solutions technologies, which followed day one that had a primary focus on finance. So we've been blending, building nicely from finance through to solutions, and now we're finishing up today with a bit of a mix. In terms of participation, we've 188 registered participants and 130 pitches. On the first day, we had a pretty much an almost even split between international and domestic participation. Yesterday was primarily domestic, 87% domestic with 13% international. Our gender split, day one was 62 male, 38 female. Today, yesterday was 72 male, 28 female. So we're hoping today that we managed to get that balance a little bit better. Very much enjoyed yesterday listening to our sponsors, TIQ, GHD, and BHP, which we'll get the opportunity to listen to again today. So what I'd like to do is encourage people to engage in the pitches, but more importantly, perhaps, is to engage in the networking. So make sure in the marketplace or in the foyer you follow up the people that you listen to in the pitches and make those connections. That's what this event is about, connections. So I'll stop there, and I'd like to hand over to our keynote for this morning, Leanne Kemp, who is the Queensland Chief Entrepreneur. Leanne is going to provide us with I guess, a view of how Queensland supports startups and entrepreneurial activity. Okay, Leanne, come on.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, and of course, I'm always the end of the sentence, that beginning of the day, and is it going to be a question mark or an exclamation mark, who knows? But I am Queensland's Chief Entrepreneur, and I'm the third entrepreneur to be appointed in this role. It's an honorary role that was introduced by the Queensland government some 4 years ago. Queensland, of course, is an outstanding place. You know, we are the largest exporter of goods and services, greater than New South Wales and Victoria combined. We also are the home of some of the grandest wonders of the world, being the Great Barrier Reef. We have huge natural resources in our extractive industries, but also we have incredible natural talent, which is really where the Office of Queensland's Chief Entrepreneur begins its work. Advanced Queensland sits under the Minister for Innovation, and you would have heard in the keynote speeches delivered at the opening of this event from our Deputy Director General, Dr. Sarah Pearson, the vehicle that sits behind innovation and entrepreneurship, startups and scale-ups, is a whopping $755 million, committed in infrastructure like this, where we're housing this event today. But it also enables the connective tissue across our state, not only thinking about the innovation and the needs and the challenges of today, but building the businesses of tomorrow. And what we do very well right now is we are able to bring the future forward, to understand the needs of the challenges far out into 2030 and 2050, when we start casting our mind forward, is what will global supply chains look like? Are we still relevant as a state and a country across the world? And what can we do to bring that collective muscle? To have a healthy ecosystem around startups and scale-ups and entrepreneurs, of course, takes a well-defined biodiversity, just as we would see, and we can perfect that in some of our natural resources like the Great Barrier Reef. And in our ecosystem across startups and scale-ups, it takes universities, government, startups themselves, entrepreneurs, corporates, of course, and funding mechanisms, either by way of government support or directly through capital markets and VCs, and even seed investors and angel investors like mum and dad. We have around 35,000 startups and entrepreneurs, great inventors across this state, and not all of them are housed like me or even wear a hoodie like me. Some of them are farmers that are solving very real problems on their land and in their wider community. These are farmpreneurs, those that have walked the lands for many, many decades and have generationally built this learned muscle strength, and are now starting to think about the adaptation and the adoption of technologies in a far better way to solve some of the challenges. Water is the source of life. So there is no doubt about it that it touches our lips every day. Of course, it touches our plants to enable us to grow, and then ultimately for all of us to eat. So it is one of the most important threads, both from a policy perspective, but also in terms of innovation. And it's hard to believe, in terms of my opening speech 3 days ago, that we have some concerns only sitting 3 to 5 hours drive here from what is clearly a heavily infrastructured central city to Australia. When we think about the types of programs that are involved, I mean, typically when we are sort of 5 years as a government into our innovation journey to support our scale-ups and our entrepreneurs, it's typically led by ideas. How do we bring about the use of capital infrastructure like this? One could even say we have the best adult kindergartens in Queensland, where we all get to enjoy that innovation collision, bumping into another entrepreneur in the hallway, maybe even a policy maker, or downstairs here, 1 floor below me, we have the Department of Natural Resources, we have our Open Data Government team here, and more recently, we will also have the Open Innovation team that will sit right there across from my desk. So why is this important? Well, it's clearly important because the world is being tipped upside down. There's tectonic plate shifts that are occurring, whether it's right now in the midst of COVID or the second tsunami wave that's likely to hit us in the economic downturn, and then there's the third, sustainability, climate and environment. And in somewhat of a sprint to the end, it is really a marathon run. How can we build an innovation ecosystem that doesn't necessarily only attract that unicorn status, those mythical creatures that everyone or some people aspire to? In Queensland, we have zebras, the rare but real companies that are walking the safari lands of Queensland, that are starting to forage on the challenges, not necessarily always ideas-driven, but are very clear about the challenge or the problem to be solved. And out of those problems and challenges, of course, become opportunities. Now, we have many corporates that are connected here as a part of this 3-day conference, and so too have we had many governments. I would say the most important part of the journey with entrepreneurship, funding will come and building a team, is a general byproduct of one thing: knowing the problem to be solved, and knowing the timing if that problem is able to be solved now in terms of the innovation loop with new and emerging technologies, but is the industry ready to make that change? And that is really parts of where corporates can signal the importance of adoption. It's great that we have ideas, and entrepreneurs are fantastic. We find certainty in uncertainty, which is why we fare incredibly well in the time of a crisis. But corporates can help to hold out their hands, to define those problems, to identify at the front end the customers that are probably your customers that could become joint customers of the startup or the scale-up, and to begin to start to mind shift away from innovation being disruptive to startups can help co-evolve. We can co-evolve an industry together. We're able to co-evolve in terms of an innovation or a scientific breakthrough. And just the mind shift change around exactly that will help to provide a far better lexicon of language around de-risking what is seen to be somewhat of a risk when it comes to the unknown state. Someone said to me once, you know, entrepreneurs are quite amazing. Every time I speak to you, Leanne, it feels as though you're giving me the glass half full scenario. And then, of course, I speak to corporates and sometimes I come across and it's the glass half empty. But the reality is, when people look in my glass, there's only a drop of water. We have a small team, maybe we're underfunded, maybe it's just an idea, maybe it's sitting in a PowerPoint presentation. But the one thing that entrepreneurs have, which is our skill set and our power, is the fact it doesn't matter if there's only a drop of water in the bottom of the glass. We still see it as half full because we know where to find the water. So everyone, go find the water because entrepreneurs know where it's at. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Leanne, who is now sprinting off into the distance with her hoodie.